The summer of 1940 opened bright and deceptively gentle over England, the kind of season that makes hedgerows hum and river water look like glass. But the sky had become a frontier. France had fallen. The British Expeditionary Force had come home from Dunkirk in battered flotillas, leaving boots in the surf and wreckage on the beaches. Now the Channel was a narrow gray moat, and beyond it waited the greatest air armada in the world. If Britain was to live, young men would have to hold the line where sunlight fades into high blue. The plan against them was blunt. The Luftwaffe would break fighter command in the air and on the ground, then sweep the Royal Navy aside while German troops crossed in barges. Operation Sea Lion depended on air superiority. Hermann Göring promised Hitler it would be easy. He had squadrons of Messerschmitt Bf-109s to clear the sky, twin-engine Bf-1010s to escort, and bombers, Heinkel 101s, Dornier, Junkers 88s, to hammer ports, radar masts, and runways. The Stuka, which had terrorized Poland and France, would dive like a dropped spear. Britain had fewer fighters and fewer pilots. On paper, the RAF should have been finished by August. What the paper missed was the system. From the Isle of Wight to the Thames, a chain of tall lattice towers, chain home, threw invisible beams across the channel. Their echoes crawled along cathode ray tubes in darkened rooms, where women with grease pencils moved colored blocks across a map the size of a billiard table. Phone lines stitched those rooms to sector stations, and sector stations to squadrons dispersed on grass strips and hard runways. Controllers weighed plots, wind, and altitude, then barked orders across headsets. At the word "scramble," pilots bolted from deck chairs, teacups still warm, and sprinted for Hurricanes and Spitfires as ground crews yanked away starter trolleys. Merlin engines caught with a cough and a rising snarl, and within minutes silver specks were angling up through sun haze to meet black knots of incoming bombers. The first weeks were a knife test. German formations probed coastal convoys, baited patrols, and struck radar masts. The Stuka learned what an alerted fighter screen could do to a dive bomber. Pinned against the sky during its pullout, it became a falling anvil. The Ju-87 vanished from the main battle after brutal losses. By August, the fight moved inland. The Luftwaffe began hitting the heart of fighter command, its airfields and sector stations. Biggin Hill's hangars burned. Kenley's runways were lifted into rubble by delayed action bombs. Tangmere took such a pounding that wrecks were bulldozed into craters to make temporary surfaces. Armorers loaded drums and belts in the open while sirens wailed. Refuelers worked through shrapnel dust. Pilots taxied through smoke and landed between potholes gouged since they had taken off. The air war itself was intimate and violent. 100 miles an hour of closure in a turning fight meant human decisions were measured in heartbeats. Spitfires tangled with the 109s. Hurricanes, tougher and better gun platforms, shouldered into bomber boxes and raked them at convergence. 8.303 Brownings could saw a Dornier's wing route open in a 2-second burst, but often needed several passes. In return, a Heinkel's dorsal gunner had a way of spoiling a perfect approach. Pilots learned to slide across the bomber's blind spots and to keep an eye on the sun where enemy fighters liked to pounce. Combat might start at 20,000 feet and end in a hedgerow, black smoke trailing past the white scribbles of contrails. In dispersal huts that evening, the empty chair at the end of the table said more than any casualty list. Then came Adler Tag, Eagle Day, August 13th, when Göring threw weight like a hammer. The channel filled with engines. British controllers, half blind in ground haze and radio clutter, fed squadrons into stacked battles that rolled from Sussex to the Thames. 2 days later, August 15th, the Luftwaffe tried a two-sided blow, sending large forces from Norway against the north while southern groups pressed Kent. They found Hurricanes over Yorkshire instead of open sky. The northern thrust limped home with awful losses. The twin-engine Bf-110, sold as a long-range fighter, proved heavy and vulnerable once separated from its bombers. Polish and Czech pilots, flying for a country they could not go home to, slashed through it with a fury that scored entire squadrons' tallies in a week. Number 303, Polish squadron, even entering the battle late, would post a kill rate that made veterans shake their heads. By the last week of August, the crisis was raw. Sector stations south of London were pounded daily. Controllers worked from backup rooms as glass showered down. In some places, the plotting tables moved to basements, while bomb-splintered roofs were patched with tarps. Dowding and Park, the air marshal and the fighter group commander, refused to be drawn into wasteful set-piece battles. They let formations come, met them near the coast, then broke contact before the 109s, short on fuel, could press advantage. German intelligence misread the restraint as weakness and reported the RAF on its last wings. British factories, in truth, were turning out fighters faster than the Luftwaffe believed, and repair shops were cannibalizing wrecks into flyable machines in days. On September 7th, the target changed. Bombers roared up the Thames and laid a ribbon of fire across London's docks. The Blitz had begun. Goering thought striking the capital would break British will and draw the last fighters into a fatal defense. He also, crucially, eased pressure on the sector stations just as they were beginning to stagger. Night after night, civilians learned the taste of grit and cordite while searchlights combed a ceiling of cloud. Anti-aircraft guns hammered. In underground platforms, families slept on blankets as dust filtered down and the rails thrummed with passing trains. At first, the RAF had no true night fighter system, only moonlight, listening posts, and courage. But by day, the young men still climbed, fought, and landed on tires bald from scrambles. The battle's hinge came on September 15th. Wave after wave crossed the coast under high escort, and Britain threw nearly everything with serviceable guns and tanks into the air. Over London, bomber boxes buckled under coordinated attacks. 109s, tight on fuel from the ride across, could not loiter. Londoners looked up from streets and rooftops and saw dogfights tilt across afternoon light, black crosses and roundels turning around one another like coins. By evening, with losses heavy and results thin, Göring called it off. Hitler postponed the invasion. The barges waited at their moorings until autumn storms made the channel their master again. The cost for the defenders was carved into dispersal boards. 544 RAF fighter pilots killed, many more wounded. More than 1,700 British aircraft lost. Germany bled too. Experienced crews gone, confidence shaken, the promise of an easy victory spent. In Parliament that August, while the outcome was still undecided, Winston Churchill spoke the line that would become the epitaph of the season. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. It was not rhetoric to the men who strapped in twice or three times a day, hands shaking as they signed Form 700s, then steadied on the throttle as the Merlin's note climbed and the grass ahead blurred to take-off speed. When autumn finally dulled the edges of the days, the squadrons made their quiet inventories. A new man staring at a locker that wasn't his, a letter to a mother in Calgary or Auckland or Krakow, a Spitfire in fresh paint with the same squadron code and a different soul. The sector stations pulled tarps over their roofs and fixed the windows. Radar towers, once considered fragile, were revealed to be stubborn things. Even when blasted, they stood and were wired again. The dowding system, radar to filter room to sector to squadron to guns, had proved that information, moved faster than metal, can be a weapon. Walk the old airfields now and you can still find the outline of a blast pen in the grass and the concrete stub of a tower where a controller watched plots migrate like weather across a map. On some mornings, a preserved Spitfire or Hurricane lifts into the cool air, and the sound of its engine folds the years. The Battle of Britain was never a duel of machines alone. It was a test of a nation's nerves, measured in minutes of fuel and inches of runway. In headset, voices steadying men who were 19, and in the way the countryside learned to look up and listen as sirens wound down and silence returned. Britain did not win the war that summer, but it did not lose it, and that difference reshaped everything that followed. Without the RAF, there is no staging ground for liberation, no place from which bombers later strike occupied Europe, no island fortress to force the enemy to divide his strength. The battle was fought over farm fields, towns, and the edges of a great city, and it ended with those things still there, battered but standing. The sky remained a British room. Home remained home. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.